Okay, anyone? So which of the following is achieved when a good or service is produced up to the point where the marginal benefit to consumers is equal to the marginal cost of producing it? This is directly giving you the definition of allocative efficiency. So the correct answer is indeed B. Okay. So and these are the kind of questions that you will see when I upload sample quiz questions. When your SI leaders go over questions from this chapter, you will see that these concepts are important for your exam. Okay, so I think this just happened. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Okay, now oh, I just went up. Okay, so this is where we stopped. Now the two more, so there are two remaining concepts that I will cover. The first concept that I'm going to start today with is this idea of economic models. We already had a very informal discussion about what is a model, what is an economic model, why do we need an economic model to really understand our actual economy. So we said that our economic model is just like a model car, which is a simplified version of the real thing. A model will involve only the basic features of the actual thing. It will ignore a lot of unnecessary details. But the advantage of working with a model is that a model is simple enough that you can play with it. You can learn a lot about the actual economy by looking at an economic models. So, and in almost all the chapters that we are going to cover in this course, in almost all the concepts that we are going to analyze in this course, we will be using economic models. So economic models can be of many different kinds. Economic models can be stated in terms of a picture, of a graph. Economic models can be stated in the form of specified theory, which we're going to look at later. Economic models could be specified in the form of a mathematical equation, something which we will hardly look at in this course. So most of the economic models that we are going to be looking at are simplified version of the real thing, the real economy. And most of the economic models that we'll be looking at are graphical, meaning that we will always have a visualization of how the model looks like. And one thing that I think has motivated economists to develop economic models from the very early on is because economists argue that economics is a science. Just like any other science discipline, whether it's a physical science or a biological science, there is a lot of emphasis on using models. Because models can help you to understand critical issues, abstract issues that are very difficult to understand when you are working with the real thing. Whenever we are building a model, whether it's an economic model, whether this is a biological model, whether it is a model used by physicists, there are some common factors that we look at when we develop a model. And those features are very common. That's why I think economics is such an interesting subject area. For example, in developing any kind of models, including an economic model, you have to first specify your assumptions, just like what we did. We had 4 assumptions that we clearly stated at the beginning of our course. We will always have some kind of testable hypothesis, meaning that we will specify what is our objective. What do we want to really analyze inside of our model? We have already provided several objectives, like we want to understand why, we want to understand how, we want to understand for whom. In due time, we are also going to look at more specific objectives. For example, in the next chapter, we would like to understand something called efficiency again. We want to understand the productive capacity of the economy. In chapter 3, we will have a very specific objectives where we will like to understand the behavior of buyers and sellers in a marketplace. So every economic models that we will deal with will have a very specific objectives. Sometimes those objectives are going to be stated in the form of a hypothesis, where you will make an initial guess or an initial statement about what you are about to look at, and then you are going to use your model to refute that hypothesis. Sometimes that validity of your hypothesis is carried out just by looking at some data. Sometimes we use more sophisticated empirical tools, and sometimes we just make statements, more statements to strengthen our initial hypothesis. So when we look at an economic model or a model building process, we argue that any model building process goes through these three critical core steps. First, you make assumptions. Step 2, you make hypothesis. Step 3, you try to prove that hypothesis. If your hypothesis is wrong, you go back to step 1, make further assumptions, again try to prove or refute your hypothesis, and the cycle goes on and on. So if this is what our economic models are offering, and it seems like it is very similar to what other science disciplines are doing as well, one could make a very strong argument that economics is also a science. Now, there is obviously some clear special features of our economics that sort of distinguishes it from other science areas. To start that debate, let us point out that economics is a social science, which means that unlike any other science area, economics looks at the society. That is a very major departure from how other science areas plays out. Let me give you a canonical example. Like, let's say, if you are sort of a biological science specialist, you are a scientist in that area, and you want to understand about some kind of animal behavior, right? The best way for you to do, the best thing that you want to do when you want to understand that animal behavior is get a sample of that animal, put it into a lab setup, and do experiments on it. Are we all clear on that? So, in a biological science, in order to prove a hypothesis, you can really use lab experiments to carry out actual experiments, like give some kind of incentive to the animal in question and see how the animal responds. Is it possible to do similar kind of experiments in economics? Anyone?
We are the experiment.
Okay. We are inside of an experiment, probably that's true. Let me sort of give you a more focused example, right? One of the critical questions that we as an economist would like to understand is that how you and I spend our income, right? Whenever at the beginning of a month, when you get your salary, how do you spend that money? If you think about these critical objectives, the best way to understand how people spend their money would be to take all your money away from you, give you a little bit of money every day, and see how you respond. Are we all clear on that? Is that possible? That's possible? Oh my God.
Oh,
That would be a social experiment which will have a lot of ethical issues. You really simply cannot take away someone's income. Are we all clear on that? A major problem with social experiment or experiments related to society that there are a lot of ethical restrictions which directly prevents us from having realistic experiments. So to begin with actually, in economics it is very difficult to conduct any kind of realistic lab experiments. So most of the times what we do, we look at people as they are behaving in the actual marketplace. We think that is the lab, and we try to deduce or understand how they are behaving in that market. But that is very different from how a physicist or a biologist would look at scientific experiments. For a biologist, the experiments that he or she is conducting is controlled. It is inside of a lab. For an economist, it is impossible. Unless you have a lab, just like one we have in JP Hunt, where there is a lab setup, you will get paid if you participate in their lab experiments, and that takes us to a different subject area. We don't want to go there. But in most of the case, we really cannot do good experiments. So we really cannot, claim that economics is a full-fledged science. At least we can argue that it's a social science. Okay. Another thing that I think distinguishes economics, and this is where our important issue starts from, is that there are various ways you can look at the society, and not all views are identical. Based on how you look at the society, based on how you look at the questions that are important to our societal development, we can divide economics into two broad categories. One is called a positive analysis, and the other one is what we call a normative analysis. Positive analysis and normative analysis refers to two fundamentally different ways of looking at the economy. So this is like two different lenses through which you look at the economy. Positive economics looks at questions such as what and how. Okay? So in positive economic analysis, we are just spectators in a show. Just like we are sitting outside of Walmart and see how people are going inside and buying stuff. In this analysis, we are observers. We analyze things, how things are happening in reality, why stock prices are going up, how do you spend your income. So these are fundamentally the main way we look at the world. So positive economics basically answers two questions: why and how. Why and how. Why answers a lot of things that you and I are interested in. How explains the way the things that we are interested in are playing out. The basic idea behind positive analysis is that in this process, you are just a researcher. You are just an observer. You are just sitting in a among a crowd, and you are analyzing how the economy is playing out. That is very different from the other way you can look at the economy as well, which is called the normative economics or normative analysis. Normative analysis asks a fundamentally different questions about the same thing, about the economy. Normative economy or normative analysis asks the questions of what should be. Now, in one of the previous classes, we actually had a sort of a discussion about the distinctions between what actually is and what should be. And they are very different things, right? What actually is and what should be are two fundamentally different ideas. Please think about it. What actually is involves just looking at the first two questions that we looked at. Why and how, right? Why something is happening, how something is happening, really answers the first way of looking at the economy, the positive economics. Normative economics really asks the other critical question, how things should be, right? So at this point, this idea seems kind of like abstract, but it is not. It is very much related to our everyday life. In positive economics, we ask questions like, why is the stock price going up? How does the price level affect us? What kind of role the government plays in our life? These are very basic questions that you always ask in positive economics. In positive economics, all the questions that you ask can be proven or refuted by looking at the data. So any kind of hypothesis that you make in positive economics can be proven because it is just an observation about the economy. If someone tells you that, hey, whenever price goes up, there appears to be a decrease in my purchasing power. I buy less when price goes up. This is a positive economic analysis because the statement that I just made, the hypothesis that I just provided can be proven or disproven. Are we all clear on this? The problem with the normative analysis is that normative analysis always asks about the idealistic world. It always asks questions about what should be, right? So the word that I always associate normative economics with is value judgment. Let's write that down so that we remember it. Whenever we look at normative analysis, we use something of a value judgment. Meaning that when you are looking at the world, you are being very critical because you are asking yourself, is this right? Is this how things should be? Right? Now, when you look at these questions, these are high-minded questions, right? These are questions that are usually asked by a policymaker. Whenever a policymaker is looking at the tax structure of US economy, the policymaker might ask himself or herself the following set of questions. Is this tax system good for the people? Is it how the tax system should be? Whenever you ask this kind of question, these are involving value judgment. Because the answer to these questions could be very, very different from one person to another person. If you are rich, you might think that the existing tax policy in USA is very unfair, right? Because you pay like 40% corporate profit tax, your income tax is also substantially high. Anytime you invest, you buy a machine, government takes money from you. Anytime you make a profit in stock market, government takes money away from you in the form of taxes. So if you are rich, you would argue that the tax system in USA is unfair, right? If you are poor in USA, you probably would also say that the tax system is unfair because the government still takes a lot of money away from the poor, right? But then there are countries where the tax system is what we call a fully progressive tax system, where the more income you have, the more tax you pay. The US tax system is not entirely progressive, something that we're going to look at 4 or 5 chapters from now. So, in a progressive tax system such as the ones exist in most of the European countries, the poor would argue that the tax system is good for them, the rich would argue that the tax system is bad for them. Notice immediately that these questions involve answers that involve value judgments. It is not true for every group. Are we all clear on this? These kind of normative questions are very difficult to understand and analyze. And in a principal level course like this one, we will, for most of the part, stay away from normative analysis. We will stay away from asking questions about what should be. Our main task in this question, in this course, is to understand what is happening and how they are happening. Okay, let us move on and see. Look at a question, some of these questions that we face in our everyday life, and this is, I think, it's a very interesting question. And look at the question. The question is asking you something that is outrageous, right? Should, education, medical school be free? It's an interesting question. I have never thought about this, right? And I think none of you have either. So what would happen if when you ask the question, should medical school be free, it is starting with a word should. In your exam, you will be asked to identify whether some statement is a positive statement or a normative statement. Let us use the space that we have in the bottom to identify some of the words that we can use to see whether a statement is a positive statement or a normative statement. Whenever we see words like what, okay, so whenever we see words like what and how, we will know that these are questions related to positive economics. And whenever we see words like should or would or could, these are part of the normative economic analysis, period. So please do not get confused with statements or questions in the exam that asks you to identify and classify these questions. So let's go back a little bit. I think I went a little bit far. So our question was about college education. Okay? So should medical school be free? Obviously there are pros and cons. Some people would say yes, some people would say no. Right? Notice that immediately this involves value judgment. It is true for some people and it is not true for some other people. So if you are a supporter of this idea, you would argue that, well, if medical school is free, a lot of people will go into medical schools because medical schools are expensive. So if your medical school is free, you are going to have a lot of doctors. So we always have sort of an excess demand for doctors. There is always a shortage of doctors. So if you make medical school free, the shortage of doctors, the problem will be solved. So this is kind of good for the economy, right? Makes sense? But if you don't support this view, what would you say? Are we all clear on my question? Some people will say, yeah, this is a good idea. Make college education free. What would be a counter argument? Yes?
A counter argument for this would be something along the lines of, if you allow it to be free, then you're going to be getting a lot of people that shouldn't go to medical school that would be trying to apply, and that could get in, and then you would have more people flunking out of medical school, and it would start to make the discipline less academic.
Very good answer.
Than if you were to attract people that could afford to.
That's true. And this is actually a powerful statement, right? Imagine that it takes about 12 years, for between 9 to 12 years for a person to actually become a full doctor. And it is it is an investment. It's a huge investment for a person. The reason why a person invests 10 to 12 years of his or her life is because the return on that investment is extremely high, right? Once you become a doctor, you really get a very good salary, right? So when we see a person going into a medical school willing to invest 10 to 12 years of his or her life, we want to make that investment worthwhile. And we want to prevent people from coming to this discipline who are not willing to make this kind of sacrifice. So there has to be a price for every investment. There has to be a price for everything that you do, right? So no education should be free. That's a positive question. That's a value judgment question, right? When I say that no education should be free, a lot of you are going to become angry, right? Because there are intense debate about this critical question of how long or to what extent should we make education free. Should we make education free only for the primary level? Should we make education free only for the secondary level? Should we make education free for undergraduate? We don't know. These are questions that we're going to avoid because it involves value judgment and it can sort of create debates that we are not prepared or qualified to address at this point of time. Let's look at a question that asks you to do what you will be asked to do in the exam. Identify whether a statement is a positive or a normative statement. This one, sorry, I apologize. This one went back to the previous one. Let me skip that. This is the normative economic question. I apologize. I'm still struggling with the new technology that I'm trying to use. I will get over it very quickly. Okay. So any thought on this one? Okay, so some people say D, should the college charge lower tuition to smarter students. Somebody said B, if the college provided more financial aid, would more students go to college? So somebody said B is the correct answer, right? Is B a normative statement or a positive statement? B actually has a word would, right? But does that mean that B is a normative statement? B can be proven, right? You can literally see what happened to student enrollment when financial aid went down or went up. These are empirical observations. You can collect data on that, you can analyze that data, and you can either support or refute this statement. Right? Are we all clear on that? So B does not involve any value judgment. These are just hard-core data related answers. Right? So B is not a normative statement, B is a positive statement. So blindly looking at words like would or could is not going to save you in the exams. We need to understand whether these would or should question are raising questions that involve value judgment. And D does that. Right? D is asking for your opinion. It is not asking what is actually happening. It is asking you what do you think should be the solution to a problem, right? And that involves value judgment, and that is always normative question. If you think about for 1 minute, you would realize that normative questions are much interesting than positive ones. Positive questions are usually boring, right? You have to spend a lot of time collecting data, analyzing the data. Sometimes these data are rigged, they are not reliable. So sometimes you do things in a positive economic analysis which doesn't really make sense, and most importantly are not that important or interesting. So why do we spend so much time, or why will we be spending so much time looking at the positive economics, where normative questions tend to be more interesting? They are closer to our heart because it involves value judgment, and we always would like to make comments about everything. Why do we do that? Why are we avoiding normative questions? Do everyone avoid normative questions? The answer is clearly no. There are part of the population that is mainly concerned about normative questions, right? If you think about the judges, right? You know, high court judges, very regularly the kind of questions that they face are normative questions. They face questions that are related to ethics, that are related to subjective value judgment. That's why the role of a judge is very critical. Policymakers such as the president, the chairman of the Fed, they also regularly face and make decisions about normative questions. These are all very qualified people. These are very qualified professionals because they go through a rigorous positive economic analysis process. After that, with years of experience, only then they encounter and address normative questions, which we will also be doing. Which means that towards the very end of this course, we will encounter normative questions. We will encounter real life, realistic normative questions, and we will see how much we can do in answering those questions. But that's very, very far away. Okay, I skipped one problem that is related to your understanding about how an economic model works. Please look at that question on your own. This is not a very difficult one. I want to conclude this chapter by looking at the two major branches in economics that really sets the tone for this course. This course is about principles of microeconomics, but microeconomics is not the only sort of branch in economics where we look at the economy, right? There are predominantly two branches that looks at the economy, or the different versions of the economy. One is what we call microeconomics, and the other one is what we call macroeconomics. Some of you will take the principles of macroeconomics probably later. Some of you probably have already taken the course, and some of you is currently taking that course. There is a lot of combination. So the basic difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics is that both of them are interested in looking at and understanding the economy. The main way through which microeconomics differs from macroeconomics is in their scope. Scope. Let's look at the definition of microeconomics. Microeconomics mainly studies individual things. It studies households and firms, how they make choices. It looks at how this in a group of households interact with the group of firms. It looks at how government attempts to influence their choices, but these choices, these influences are only on a single market, on a small group of buyers and on a small group of producers, or in a small or a separate market. The focus on the microeconomics is, when I look at microeconomics, I always think of microeconomics as looking at a tree. You look at a tree or a group of trees, try to understand how the nature of those trees, and when we look at macroeconomics, I think that we look at the forest. Okay, so what does macroeconomics do? Macroeconomics is the study of the economy as a whole, including topics such as inflation, unemployment, and economic growth, right? So microeconomics is going to try to understand how do we spend money, or how do firms make profit, what happens when government raises tax, how do you change your consumption pattern, when the government raises your sales tax, do you buy more milk or do you buy less milk? These are questions that microeconomics looks at. Macroeconomics will look at probably the same set of questions, but for the overall economy. Macroeconomics would like to understand when government raises taxes, how do the overall economy reacts to that. Macroeconomics will look at whenever there is a change in price, overall price level of the economy, which is called inflation, how do the economy responds to that, right? So the distinction between microeconomics and macroeconomics is mainly in terms of looking at a tree versus looking at a forest. Makes sense? There are also other critical distinctions between microeconomics and macroeconomics, and when you look at things like unemployment and economic growth, you understand why. Microeconomics is not sufficiently sophisticated to address these critical economic issues. Why do unemployment exist? Why do some people get fired from their job? Or how do you grow an economy? These are questions that require you to have an idea about the overall economy. These are questions specifically related to the forest, and macroeconomics can look at those questions and microeconomics cannot. But I want to tell you that over time, the distinction between microeconomics and macroeconomics are becoming sort of not that important anymore. Because a lot of us, including myself, look at the macroeconomy from a micro perspective. Because everything that we are learning in this course will be relevant in the macroeconomic course that we are going to look at. Because your macroeconomics is a sum of individual microeconomy. The forest is the sum of individual trees, right? So there is a strong rationality for understanding individual trees before we move on to looking at the forest. Okay, so let's look at the question that asks you the distinction between micro and macro. Let's go over this question quickly. Okay, so which one is the correct answer? Is everyone agree on the fact that D is the correct answer? So D is the only answer that looks at the entire forest. So the correct answer is D. Okay. Thank you very much. That's the first chapter that we sort of successfully covered. Then the one that I'm going to start, I have exactly 9 minutes, sufficient for me to start the chapter and then start talking about it. So our chapter number 2 is where we will start looking at actual, sort of microeconomic material. So chapter 2 is going to mainly talk about these issues. Okay? So these are the learning objectives for our chapter. We are first going to look at something called production possibility frontier and this idea of opportunity cost. Production possibility frontier will be a graphical tool and to some extent an economic model that will tell us how an economy makes production decisions. And we are going to connect with that this very important idea of opportunity cost. When an economy is making production decisions, how do opportunity costs play out in that decision? In the next class, and probably towards the beginning of next week, we are going to cover two other very critical issues. One issue is what we already sort of gave you a hint in the previous chapter class, which was this idea of trade. Trade is kind of important. Trade, when you exchange goods and services between two persons, when you buy goods from a foreign country, sell goods to a foreign country, when you buy goods from another person from another region, trade is a fundamental idea. Trade is at the core of human civilization. Without trade, we would not be where we are right now. And we want to understand trade from a very core perspective, from a very rudimentary perspective. We are going to talk about the basic theory behind trade. Why do people, firms, and country trade? By talking about something called comparative advantage that was developed by a very, very famous Latin economist, David Ricardo. And then we are going to conclude this chapter by looking at a very general overview about the market system. What is a market? How do market exist and things like that. Today, our main focus is going to be to cover the first critical issue of this chapter, which is probably the first microeconomic concept, which is this idea of production possibility frontier. This is what I usually refer to as a loaded concept, which means everything related to production possibility frontier is important. Our discussion about production possibility frontier again will start from the core idea, the most important idea that I highlighted in the previous chapter, which is scarcity. Scarcity is why we are studying this course. And scarcity is exactly why we are going to start with production possibility frontier in this course. Scarcity is so important that it forces an economy to seriously think about what things it can produce and what things it should not produce. Which means that if you have scarcity of resources in your economy, you face the problem of trade-off. Which means that the unfortunate fact of an economic decision is that whenever you want to produce something, you have to give up producing something else. Which means that as an economy, we face trade-offs. Trade-offs. And our production possibility frontier will give us a visualization of that trade-off. Right? So we are going to start with a problem, a sort of like artificial economic problems. The problems is starting with this brand Tesla. I'm sure all of you are familiar with that. They make these hybrid cars, actually electric cars. We are considering a situation where Tesla can make sedans or they can make SUVs. Okay, one is a large car, the other one is a small car. Tesla has a resource problem, right? Tesla has a scarcity problem. Tesla had some limited resource, and Tesla has to make a decision about whether it wants to produce more SUVs or more sedans. You can see clearly that there is a trade-off, right? If you want to produce more cars, sedans, you have to produce less SUVs and vice versa. Vice versa is a Latin word, which means that the other way round is also true. Right? Are we all clear on this? Okay, let's look at the definition. Please read the definition. Every part of this definition is important because I can assure you the definition is in your exam. The production possibility frontier. PPF is a curve, it's a graph that shows the maximum attainable combination of two goods that may be that maybe purchases with available resources and current technology. What does purchases means? Anyway, so it shows the maximum amount of output, combinations of output that you can produce, given you utilize all your resources. So production possibility frontier shows you the maximum combination of two goods that you can produce, right? Or let's focus on the word may. The question may is important because if you look at the question, it's asking a simple question: Is a production possibility frontier a positive tool or a normative tool? Can we use production possibility frontier to carry out our positive economic analysis? The answer is clearly yes. Production possibility frontier is a positive economic tool. It shows you how an economy can produce. What are the different combinations of goods that an economy can produce? So, production possibility frontier answers the question of how and what. It does not answer the question of what should be. So, it is clearly a positive economics tool. Okay, so this chapter is heavy with graphical interpretation and graphical illustration. So, let us look at our first graph of production possibility frontier. Any graph that we are going to draw in this chapter, in this course, we will always start with data, because our graphs will not come from out of thin air. There is data, and we take that data and we will represent that in a graphical setup. That's how we are going to graph some graphs. So therefore, our discussion is going to start with the table in this slide. Okay? So the table, if you look at this, is showing you different production choices or production possibilities that are available to Tesla. It can either produce sedans, it can either produce SUVs, or a combination of those. A, B, C, D, and E are different production possibilities that is available to Tesla given the resources it has. In A, Tesla is only producing sedans. In E, Tesla is only producing SUVs. Between A and E, there are also other combination of these two goods that Tesla could produce. In the next class, we are going to draw this. Thank you very much.
You had sent an email on Blackboard about the note taking. Has anyone filled that position?
Which one?
Note taking.
No, nobody has yet taken that position.
Okay.
So please follow the instructions that is being provided.
What I did. So I didn't know if I was supposed to email you because I want to.
No, you don't have to email me.
Okay.
You have to email the CEA authority, and they're gonna give you instruction as how you will collect the lecture notes and how you will submit the lecture notes to them.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
When I'm signing up for SI,